A mural featuring that wonderful poem, an iconic poem, has been defaced by students at Manchester University. Why? Well, because they say Rudyard Kipling is a racist. They've erased it, they've replaced it with a piece by the American black author Maya Angelou. And they say a bid to reverse black and brown voices being written out of history. Well, let's debate whether or not we should be effectively rewriting history, judging people of the past by the values of today. Let's talk about this with Fred Dimbleby. He's former editor of the Oxford student paper Charwell. It is currently still a student there. And Tom Slater, who's deputy editor of Spiked Online. Good morning to you, gentlemen.
Morning.
Good morning. Fred, let me start with you. Do you think that the students were right to deface this mural? They don't like what Rudyard Kipling's views were at the time, bearing in mind he wrote that poem in 1895, and they decided to deface that mural. Do you think they were right to do it?
I think these students were completely within their right to do this. This is their private space. This is their student union, remember. It's in one building in one university in the UK. And when you republish a poem like this, you're also republishing the views of that individual. And this is Rudyard Kipling. You say in that introduction, we remember him from The Jungle Book, but also you remember him talking about Filipino people as new court sullen peoples, half devil and half child. This is not someone who represents the views of the student union.
Well, hold on a minute. Why should a man who died decades ago represent the views of the student union?
Because it's a poem that's being put up in the student union.
It's a bloody good poem.
I mean, we can debate whether it's a good poem or not, but
I don't think there is a debate over that. I think it's a good poem.
Well, I think there is debate over that, but I think that's not the main point here. I think it's about what it represents, and if that doesn't fit in with what the students believe in Manchester, what my generation of students think about politics and about social issues, then I don't see why it should be up there.
Okay, Tom Slater, you're deputy editor of Spiked Online, very much a sort of libertarian leftist viewpoint. Were the students right to do what they did?
In a way, I think it's less a question of whether it was within their rights to do it. It's more a question of why are they doing it. I think there's a certain element to student politics today, which is increasingly quite a liberal, seems to kind of rage against the world and increasingly against history as well. But nevertheless, it just strikes me as I can't quite work out. There seems to be a kind of element of student identity politics, which is so keen to find things to feel aggrieved about, to feel victimised about, that increasingly there's a tendency to almost look back in the past because they're running out of things to be offended by in the present. And are they within their right to do it? Potentially. I mean, it's their space. There seems to have been almost retroactively approved by the Students' Union, and slightly strange shift. But I just don't understand why students who claim to be interested in radical politics are spending so much time being upset by a poem which wasn't even on that wall and kind of confusing redecorating for activism. I just think it kind of speaks to, in many respects, the kind of low horizons of a lot of students.
We've seen this an awful lot. We've seen this in American universities, and we've sort of imported this to this country. This idea, this activism against the past. This whole idea of judging people from the past, judging whether it's authors, whether it's playwrights, whether it's politicians, or anybody or business people, judging them by the values of today, values of 2018, 100 years ago. I've got to be honest, I'm not sure that even makes sense. It seems to me that there are an awful lot of people who would, if they were born, if they were 18 years old now, would have perfectly sort of liberal, modern British views. But at the time, they held what were the normal, typical views at that time, which were unfortunately rather negative views of people of other ethnicities, other religions, other races, and other countries. That was the norm. It doesn't mean they were bad people. They were just people of their time, surely, Tom.
Well, I think the question of whether or not they're bad people is something that we can kind of discuss. I mean, and I think there is a kind of bit of a failure of context here in relation to not really putting these things, as you say, in terms of what the views were at the time. But I think increasingly a lot of these campaigns, whether it's this piece of activism at Manchester, whether it's the Rose Must Fall campaign at Oxford a few years ago, calling to pull down that statue of the colonialist Cecil Rhodes, I think it says far more about how students see themselves in the present and how we might want to understand what happened in the past. It just strikes me that students today are preaching a kind of ideology which says that a lot of students, particularly minority students, are so wounded, so fated by history, that effectively any remnant of it is something which is likely to do them harm. And I just think that's a pretty downbeat way to look at yourself in the world.
Well, Fred Dimbleby, you're a bright guy. You're at Oxford, for goodness sake. The poem that was, If was replaced by a poem by Maya Angelou, I have to say a poem I absolutely love, Still I Rise. The justification for replacing Kipling's work with this Maya Angelou poem came from Sarah Khan. She's, I love this title, the Liberation and Access Officer at the Union. I mean, you've got to laugh. She wrote on Facebook that Kipling's racist work, she said, supported the role of the British Empire, and Angelou's poem was chosen as a reclamation of history by those who've been oppressed by the likes of Kipling for so many centuries. Now, let's clarify. Rudyard Kipling was a journalist and a playwright and an author. It seems to me that he wasn't busy oppressing people in the empire. He was just busy living his life. Do we believe that everybody who wasn't sort of 100 years ahead of the thought police at the time is somehow an oppressor of the past who needs to be, I suppose, outed and defamed now?
Well, I mean, the idea that Kipling is, just part of his generation, that no one else really thought like we do now, is completely wrong. Orwell once called him in the 1940s morally insensitive and aesthetically disgusting. He was called out again by Mark Twain later on. So people would, criticise him in the contemporary context.
Fred, can I interrupt? Can you just keep your phone still, because it's very difficult to hear you when it's moving around a lot.
No problems. We'll do. But
young people in technology, what can I say?
I know. But the other point here is that I'm kind of interested why the right is so interested by this. Tom, you yourself have written many articles about this. You've written a book about free speech. You've debated it again and again. You've even started a campus tour called the Unsafe Space Tour. Why are you spending so much of your time doing this? What is the actual fear here?
Okay, Tom Slater, why don't you answer that?
Well, first of all, I'm glad you're so aware of my work. But I think the first thing is Spikes has never come at this from a right-wing perspective. If anything, I think it speaks to a failure and a kind of distortion of progressive politics amongst a lot of students these days, not just because there's a lot of censorship and a lot of illiberalism, but because there seems to be a failure of belief in the kind of positive aspects of progressive politics, the ability of young people to make a change in the world. It seems to me that so much of campus politics now is about raging against things they dislike rather than putting forward arguments for how they want the future to be different. And if you even take something like the Rose Must Fall campaign, which I think is something very similar to what we saw in Manchester, you saw students making arguments that effectively they were being harmed by this remnant of history, that walking past this statue was the equivalent of being punched in the face. And it just strikes me that a lot of this victim politics speaks to the fact that whereas in the past a lot of students thought that they could make a change in the world, that they could make history, students today increasingly think they're being beaten up by history. And that just strikes me as a huge problem for anyone who's interested in progressive politics. And students used to be, previously a kind of laboratory in which new ideas were coming forward. Now everything's incredibly down.
I mean, Fred, when I was at university, it was all about freeing Nelson Mandela. Certainly it was, things like when my parents were around, it was about, the 1968 revolutions and all that and uprisings. There seems to me that students in the past perhaps have had rather more sort of, more worthy causes than statues, than murals. Shouldn't student unions be bothered about things like rising rents, rising debt of students, rising conditions, worse conditions, the problems that students have actually getting their tutors to actually give lectures, give them the teaching that they have actually paid for and got into huge debt for? Shouldn't they be worried about those practical things rather than worrying about a 100-year-old poem?
But this is the point. It's because you have completely overemphasised the amount that this type of activism is taking place at universities, because this is some idea that there is this generation who just want to take away all our freedoms to say horrible things about people. That is one part of what's going on, that kind of this type of thing we're talking about today. But also student unions a representative role through every issue. Students came out in their thousands at the weekend last weekend to protest Donald Trump. They are standing up for a wider range of social and political values. And the right just wants to grasp onto this idea of...
Well, no, it's not. It's not the right. Many on the liberal left are very concerned about this. This idea of sort of shutting down anything that has happened before that you don't like, and potentially sort of wiping it out. It's a very new concept, and it's certainly not of the liberal left. I mean, I was brought up in a liberal left household. The idea that you would deface a poem because you didn't like what the person had said would have been utterly bizarre 20 years ago.
But I'm still interested about what you think the consequence of this could be. This is
the consequence is that people like me, and I think large numbers of people, and probably most future employers of the students who've done this, think you're all a bunch of complete lunatic snowflakes, and they don't want to touch you with a barge pole. That's what I think.
Well, it's nice because the trivialising of mental health on radio.
Oh, there you go.
We're trying to fight against.
But now, Fred, and it's exactly that response that will make you unemployable.
I mean, if
seriously
people like that want to employ me, I don't want to be employed by them. I
don't think it's going to be an issue. Tom Slater, I'm going to give you the final word. I'm busy apparently dissing people with mental health, but that's the sort of response. This is where we are. I mean, do you know what? I'm still going to stick to the view that if students were just drinking more and having more sex, they would be having a lot better time. That's what we did in my day.
I think there's probably something to that. But just on the kind of question of what the consequences of this are, I think the fundamental consequences are for students themselves and for student politics. You've got a whole generation who seem to think that censorship is something you should be involved in rather than freedom, and who seem to think that constantly trying to kind of cleanse their immediate environment of things that upset them is the equivalent of progressive political activism. And it just strikes me that the big problem about this whole climate, this whole victimhood politics that students are so involved in, is that it makes them more and more obsessed about trivialities and less interest in actually doing something. That, I think, is the main consequence of all of this.
OK, thank you very much. Fred Dimbleby, Tom Slater, fascinating debate. We'll get that online if you missed the beginning of that. We are in bizarre times. We really are. 9:31 is the time.